On September 14, 1847, in a plantation house 12 miles south of Charleston, South Carolina, something happened that local authorities tried to bury for over 60 years. 7 members of the Grantham family were found dead in their beds, their throats opened with surgical precision. The only person missing from the estate was a young enslaved man named Samuel, purchased 3 years earlier for the extraordinary sum of $800, not for his strength or skill, but because his skin was white as porcelain and his eyes the color of rose quartz. The Charleston Courier ran exactly one story about the incident before the paper's owner received a visit from 3 prominent planters. No trial was ever held, no body was ever found. But in the weeks following that September night, 4 other plantation families reported thefts of traveling papers, forged documents and money, always taken while the household slept, always without a sound. The official story claimed Samuel drowned crossing the Ashley River. The unofficial story, whispered among the enslaved community for generations, tells something far more calculated, far more patient, and far more terrifying than a simple act of rage. Now let us step back to where this nightmare truly began, 3 years before that September night, to understand how curiosity became obsession, and obsession became something that couldn't be controlled. The spring of 1844 arrived late in the South Carolina low country, bringing with it the suffocating humidity that made Spanish moss hang heavier from the live oaks and turned the air itself into something you had to push through. Grantham Plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of rice fields and timber, its prosperity built on the labor of 137 enslaved men, women, and children whose names appeared in ledgers as nothing more than numbers and estimated values. Thaddeus Grantham had inherited the estate from his father at 28, and in the 12 years since, he'd transformed himself from a mediocre planter into something of a local curiosity himself, a gentleman farmer who collected unusual things. His Charleston townhouse displayed cases of butterflies pinned in precise rows, shelves of rocks split open to reveal crystalline interiors, and jars of preserved specimens floating in amber liquid. His friends called it intellectual pursuit. His wife Constance called it obsession, but Constance had learned to accommodate her husband's fascinations. They had 3 children. Margaret, 16, already promised to the son of a tobacco magnate, Thomas Jr., 13, being groomed to inherit, and little Catherine, only 8, who still believed her father hung the stars. Constance ran the household with the efficiency expected of a plant's wife, managing the domestic staff, overseeing the kitchen, and ensuring the family maintained their position in Charleston society. The plantation house itself sat on a slight rise, as much elevation as the flat low country offered, its white columns visible from the river road. Inside, everything spoke of wealth carefully displayed: imported furniture from England, crystal from France, portraits of Grantham ancestors who'd fought in the Revolution. The library held over 300 volumes, many of them concerning natural philosophy, anatomy, and what Thaddeus called the science of racial characteristics. It was this last interest that brought Thaddeus to the Charleston slave market on a humid May morning in 1844, accompanied by his factor, Edmund Ruttled, a thin man with calculating eyes who handled the business of buying and selling human property with the same attention he gave to cotton futures. The market near Chalmers Street was already crowded, the auction block surrounded by planters evaluating the day's offerings. Thaddeus had no particular need for additional field hands. His rice operation ran efficiently enough, but Rutledge had sent word of something unusual, something that might interest a collector of rarities. "He's in the back holding pen," Rutledge explained as they pushed through the crowd. "Came up from Georgia 3 weeks ago. Trader named Harwick bought him in Augusta, but he's having trouble moving him. Price is too high for field work, and his appearance makes folks uncomfortable." They found Samuel sitting alone in a corner of the pen, separated from the other enslaved people awaiting sale. Even in the shadows, his skin seemed to glow with an unnatural pallor. When he looked up at their approach, Thaddeus felt something catch in his throat. The young man's eyes were pink, almost translucent, like looking through colored glass at something you couldn't quite name. Samuel appeared to be about 20 years old, though the trader's papers listed him as 22. He stood when Harwick called him forward, and Thaddeus noted his height, nearly 6 feet, and the unusual grace of his movements. His hair, cropped close, was white gold like corn silk. His features, despite the color anomaly, bore the unmistakable ancestry of Africa in the breadth of his nose and the fullness of his lips. "Albinism," Eric said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Eat it once before in a mule. Makes him sensitive to sun, which is why he's no good for field work, but he reads and writes. Previous owner taught him. Foolish as that was, speaks proper too, figured he might interest someone with particular tastes." Thaddeus circled Samuel slowly, the way he might examine the specimen. "You can read." "Yes, sir." Samuel's voice was quiet, carefully neutral. "What's the last thing you read?" A pause, as if Samuel was calculating the safest answer. "The Bible, sir. Gospel of Luke. Recite something." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he complied. "Blessed are ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. Blessed are ye that weep now, for ye shall laugh." Thaddeus felt a smile spread across his face. Here was something truly rare, not just the physical peculiarity, but an educated anomaly, a living specimen that could be observed, studied, catalogued. His mind was already racing with possibilities. He could document the condition, write papers for the journals in Philadelphia, perhaps even present findings to the Charleston Medical Society. $800, Harwick said, naming a price that made Rutland cough. "I know it's steep, but you won't find another like him." $700, Thaddeus counted automatically, though his mind was already made up. They settled on 750. Papers were signed, money exchanged. Samuel was led to the wagon without a word, his pink eyes fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. On the ride back to the plantation, Rutledge broke the silence. "What exactly do you plan to do with him? That's nearly twice what you'd pay for a prime field hand." Thaddeus watched the Roy. D ahead, already imagining the locked journal where he'd record his observations, the letters he'd write to colleagues in Boston and Baltimore. Study him, Edmund. Document the condition. Think of the scientific value. We're living in an age of discovery, of understanding the natural world in ways our fathers never could. This young man is a living, breathing example of nature's variations. What Thaddeus didn't say, what he perhaps didn't even recognize in himself yet, was that he'd purchased more than a subject for study. He'd acquired something he believed made him special, a collector's pride in possessing what no one else had. In the back of the wagon, hands bound with rope that wasn't strictly necessary but was traditional for a new purchase, Samuel stared at the passing landscape with those unsettling pink eyes and said nothing at all. The other enslaved people on Grand Anthem Plantation first saw Samuel when he arrived that evening, and the response was immediate and visceral. Some made signs against evil, others simply stared. The overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Cates, who enforced discipline with a whip he called Persuader, seemed uncertain how to classify this new arrival. But Thaddeus had plans that didn't involve the fields. He'd already decided that Samuel would live in a small room in the main house, in the servants' quarters near the kitchen. This proximity would allow for daily observations, measurements, tests of sensitivity to light, documentation of any peculiarities in behavior or physiology. That first night, as Constance prepared for bed, she confronted her husband about the purchase. "You brought him into the house, Thaddeus. What will people say?" "They'll say we're at the forefront of natural philosophy," Thaddeus replied, already writing in his new observation journal by candlelight. "Samuel represents a rare opportunity to study a condition that few have documented. His presence here serves science. His presence here serves your vanity," Constance said quietly, but she knew better than to push further. Her husband's enthusiasms, once ignited, burned until they exhausted themselves. This too would pass, she told herself. She just had to be patient. But in the small room off the kitchen, Samuel lay awake on the narrow bed, his pale hands folded across his chest, his pink eyes reflecting the moonlight through the single window. In the 3 years since his previous owner's death had sent him to the auction block, He'd been sold 4 times. Each owner had been drawn by his unusual appearance. Each had treated him as an object of curiosity rather than a human being. Samuel had learned many things in those 3 years. He'd learned that educated slaves made white people nervous. He'd learned that his appearance could unsettle even cruel men. He'd learned that freedom papers could be forged if you were patient enough to practice the handwriting. He'd learned that people who viewed you as a curiosity never really looked at you carefully. They saw the unusual coloring but missed the intelligence calculating behind those strange eyes. And most importantly, Samuel had learned to wait. The first 6 months of Samuel's life at Grantham Plantation followed a strange pattern that existed in a space between slavery and something else entirely. Not freedom, never that, but a peculiar kind of captivity that felt almost like theater. 2. Thaddeus had him photographed using the new daguerreotype process, the image capturing Samuel's ghostly power in unsettling detail. He measured Samuel's skull with calipers, recorded the dimensions in careful columns, and compared the numbers to measurements from his other slaves, seeking patterns that existed only in his imagination. Twice a week, Thaddeus subjected Samuel to light tolerance tests, making him stand in direct sunlight for increasing intervals while recording the time until his skin began to reen and burn. Samuel endured these sessions without complaint, his face carefully blank, while inside him something cold and patient grew stronger. The Grantham children reacted to Samuel's presence in different ways. Margaret, at 16, felt a confused mixture of fascination and repulsion. She'd been raised to view enslaved people as inferior beings, yet Samuel's education and careful speech challenged her assumptions. She took to observing him from doorways, trying to reconcile her father's scientific enthusiasm with her own unsettled feelings. Thomas Jr. adopted his father's attitude of clinical interest, asking questions about albinism and whether it could occur in other animals. At 13, he was already practicing the casual cruelty of the planter class, sometimes ordering Samuel to perform small tasks simply to assert his own authority. Only little Catherine treated Samuel as human. She was too young to fully understand the implications of ownership, and his unusual appearance fascinated her without frightening her. She began bringing him books from her father's library, asking him to read to her, a request that Constance would have forbidden if she'd known about it. It would as through Catherine that Samuel first understood the true layout of the house. As she led him to the library for their secret reading sessions, he memorized the floor plan, the servants' stair that connected all 3 floors, the back entrance through the kitchen, the door to Thaddeus's study where the plantation records were kept, and most importantly, the master bedroom where Thaddeus and Constance slept. By October of 1844, Samuel had become a fixture in the household routine. He served at dinner parties where Thaddeus would inevitably bring up his fascinating specimen and subject guests to detailed explanations of albinism. He stood silent during these displays, serving wine and clearing plates, while planters and their wives studied him with the same attention they'd give to a painting or an unusual flower arrangement. During one such dinner, a physician from Charleston named Dr. Whitfield engaged Thaddeus in an animated discussion about whether albinism represented a distinct racial category or simply a medical oddity. They debated this over roasted duck and rice, speaking about Samuel as if he weren't standing 3 feet away. "The question," Dr. Whitfield said, gesturing with his wine glass, "is whether the condition affects mental faculties. You've tested his intelligence, surely?" "Extensively," Thaddeus replied. "He's literate, articulate, capable of complex reasoning. In many ways, he's more intelligent than my field hands. Fascinating. Yet his value is diminished by the sun's sensitivity, nature's trade-off, perhaps enhanced mental capacity at the cost of physical utility." The doctor turned to Samuel directly for the first time. "Tell me, boy, do you have dreams?" Samuel's pink eyes fixed on the doctor with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. I dream of freedom." The table fell silent. Then Thaddeus laughed, a forced sound that the other guests awkwardly joined. "Well, don't we all dream of freedom from something? But we're bound by duty, by obligation, by the natural order. Isn't that right, Samuel?" "Yes, sir. Samuel replied, refilling the doctor's wineglass with a steady hand. But something in his tone made Dr. Whitfield lose his appetite for the rest of the meal. The winter of 1844 brought changes to the household routine. Thaddeus began spending more time in Charleston, attending meetings of the Medical Society, where he presented his observations on albinism to tepid interest. The scientific community was less impressed with his documentation than he'd hoped, and this rejection festered into obsession. He doubled his efforts, subjecting Samuel to increasingly uncomfortable examinations, measuring blood pressure, testing reflexes, attempting to determine if the condition affected internal organs. Samuel endured it all with the same careful passivity, but those who paid attention, and only a few did, might have noticed subtle changes. He'd begun requesting books on navigation and geography, claiming they helped him serve the family better by understanding maps when they discussed travel. Catherine, delighted to have a reading companion, brought him atlas after atlas without understanding their true purpose. He'd also cultivated a relationship with Ezra, an elderly enslaved man who worked in the stable and had been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember. Ezra had seen 3 generations of Granthams, had witnessed the slow corruption of each by the absolute power they held over other human beings. He recognized in Samuel something he'd only seen a few times in his long life: a person who had made a decision, who was waiting for the right moment to act. "You planning something?" Ezra said one evening, as they sat in the stable, ostensibly checking on a horse with a slight limp. It wasn't a question. Samuel said nothing for a long moment. "Then if a man owns you like property, treats you like an object, displays you like a trophy, what do you owe him?" "Nothing," Ezra replied, "but vengeance got a price too. You ready to pay it? I've been paying it for 22 years. Samuel's pale hand stroked the horse's neck, his touch gentle despite the anger in his voice. "Every day I've been looked at instead of seen. Every moment I've been studied instead of known. The price is already paid. Now I'm just collecting what's owed." Ezra was quiet, then nodded slowly. "Then you be careful, and you be thorough, because if you do what I think you planning, there can't be no half measures. Can't leave witnesses to tell a different story than the one you need told." By spring of 1845, Samuel had been at Grantham Plantation for a year. The household had grown accustomed to his presence, which was exactly what he'd been counting on. Familiarity bred carelessness. The family no longer watched him carefully. Thaddeus's initial scientific enthusiasm had waned. He'd exhausted the observable aspects of Samuel's condition, and the medical journals had shown little interest in publishing his findings. Samuel had become simply another servant, unusual to look at, but ultimately just part of the household. Furniture. This was when Samuel began his real preparations. He'd identified the unlocked window in Thaddeus's study, the one the planter opened on warm evenings for air circulation. He'd noted which floorboards creaked on the path from the servants' quarters to the family bedrooms. He'd learned the household's sleep patterns. Thaddeus often read late into the night while Constance took laudanum for her nerves and slept deeply. The children slept on the 3rd floor, their rooms arranged along a hallway that could be accessed by both the main staircase and the servants' stair, and he'd begun stealing small amounts at first, a few dollars from the household accounts, a page from the plantation ledger showing his purchase price, a blank sheet of paper with Thaddeus's letterhead. These items he hid in a loose board beneath his bed, along with a traveling knife he'd taken from the kitchen, its blade honed to razor sharpness on the grinding stone in the stable. But Samuel's most important theft came in July of 1845, when he managed to access Thaddeus's study while the family attended Sunday service. He'd begged off with a convincing display of stomach illness, and during the 2 hours the house stood empty, except for old Ruth in the kitchen, who was nearly deaf. Samuel copied Thaddeus's handwriting over and over until he could reproduce it perfectly. Then he drafted 3 different versions of Freedom Papers, each one more elaborate than the last, until he had a document that would pass any but the most detailed inspection. The paper declared that Samuel, having served faithfully and demonstrated unusual intelligence and character, was hereby manumitted and granted his freedom, with the right to travel unmolested throughout the United States. The date he left blank, he'd fill it in when the time came. Throughout the summer and fall of 1845, Samuel maintained his careful performance of civility while preparing for something the Grandanthem family couldn't imagine. He memorized the roads to Charleston, the schedule of the steamships that departed for northern ports, the names of free black communities in Philadelphia and Boston, where a man with unusual appearance might disappear into anonymity. He also made 2 more quiet alliances among the enslaved community. Dinah, who worked in the main house, had a daughter who'd been sold south the previous year. She understood rage. Jacob, a field hand who'd been whipped within an inch of his life for learning to read, understood revenge. Neither of them knew Samuel's exact plans, but they agreed to 2 things. They would ensure alibis on whatever night Samuel chose to act, and they would report seeing him flee toward the river, providing a false trail for any pursuit. December of 1845 brought early cold to the low country. Ice formed on the edges of the ponds, and Spanish moss hung stiff and frosted from the oak trees. The Grantham family prepared for Christmas with their usual elaborate parties and gift-giving, while Samuel watched and waited and refined his plans until they were as sharp as the blade he kept hidden beneath the loose board. On Christmas Eve, Thaddeus hosted 30 guests for dinner. Samuel served throughout the evening, invisible in his visibility, carrying trays and pouring wine while the planter class celebrated another year of prosperity built on the backs of human property. Late in the evening, after most guests had departed, Thaddeus called Samuel to the library. "I'm writing a paper on hereditary conditions," the planter said, not looking up from his desk. "I need you to provide a detailed account of your family history. Parents, grandparents, any siblings. I want to document whether albinism runs in bloodlines." Samuel stood silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. "My mother was sold away when I was 6. My father I never knew. I had a sister once, but the trader who bought her said she wouldn't last the journey south. That's my family history, sir. That's all the document you're ever going to get." Something in his tone made Thaddeus look up sharply, but Samuel's face remained carefully neutral, those pink eyes reflecting nothing but candlelight. The planter frowned, then waved dismissively. "That will be all. You may go." Samuel left the library, his heart beating steadily, his mind clear. He'd just decided something. It would be soon. Very soon, because he'd realized that Thaddeus would never see him as human, would never stop trying to categorize and measure and document him as if he were a butterfly pinned to a board. And if you're already considered dead by the people who own you, what's the harm in proving them right? The winter of 1846 arrived with unusual ferocity, bringing storms that rattled the windows of the plantation house and turned the roads to mud. Samuel used the harsh weather as cover for his final preparations, knowing that bad conditions would make pursuit more difficult. He calculated that he needed 4 hours, 2 to execute his plan, 2 to reach a hiding spot he'd prepared in the swamp, where Ezra had shown him an abandoned cabin used by Rue. Away slaves before they attempted the dangerous journey north. But something unexpected happened in February that almost derailed everything. Margaret, now 17, had been reading her father's journals and became fascinated by Samuel's case. She began seeking him out, asking questions about his experiences, his thoughts on his condition. Her interest seemed genuine, untainted by her father's scientific coldness, and for a brief moment Samuel felt something dangerous. Hope that perhaps one person in this cursed household saw him as human. That hope died on a rainy evening in March when he overheard Margaret and her mother discussing him in the parlor. "He's actually quite intelligent, Mother," Margaret said. "Perhaps more so than many white people I know. Doesn't that challenge what we've been taught about racial hierarchy?" Constance's response was sharp and immediate. "Don't let your father's scientific hobby confuse you, child. Intelligence in a slave is like a singing bird, a curiosity that amuses us, but it doesn't change what they are. Samuel is property purchased and paid for. Never forget that no matter how articulate he might be, Samuel stood frozen in the hallway, a tea service growing cold in his hands. In that moment, whatever restraint had been holding him back dissolved completely. Margaret's interest hadn't been genuine human concern. It had been the same curiosity her father exhibited, just dressed in more compassionate language. They were all the same. Every single one of them viewed him as something less than human, and that was a debt that needed settling. The spring of 1847 brought an unusual increase in tensions across South Carolina's plantation belt. Rumors spread of slave uprisings, of plots discovered and brutally suppressed, of paranoid planters sleeping with pistols beneath their pillows. The state legislature passed new laws restricting the movement of enslaved people, requiring written passes for any travel between plantations, increasing penalties for teaching literacy, and establishing harsh punishments for any black person who raised a hand against a white person, enslaved or free. Thaddeus Grantham followed these developments with obsessive attention, discussing them endlessly at dinner. He'd become convinced that education represented a danger to the social order, that literacy bred dangerous ideas in the enslaved population. It was therefore supremely ironic that he'd spent 3 years documenting an educated slave as a scientific curiosity without recognizing the contradiction in his own position. In April, Thaddeus made a decision that he announced over dinner. Samuel would be displayed at the Charleston Medical Society's annual meeting in May. The planter had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation on albinism, complete with measurements, sketches, and that unsettling daguerreotype. Samuel would stand on stage while Thaddeus pointed out his unusual characteristics to an audience of physicians and natural philosophers. Samuel received this news with his customary blank expression, but inwardly something snapped into place. This was it, the final indignity, the culmination of 3 years of being treated as an object. He would be displayed like an exotic animal before an audience of men who would examine him with the same detached interest they'd give to a geological formation. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Samuel made his final calculations. The Medical Society meeting was scheduled for May 15th. He would act on May 10th, giving him 5 days before he was supposed to be in Charleston, 5 days before anyone would question his absence seriously. The first week of May brought perfect weather. Warm days, cool nights, clear skies that promised easy travel once he made his escape. Samuel spent these days in careful observation, confirming the patterns he'd memorized. Thaddeus still read late in his study. Constance still took her lord at 9:0. The children still slept soundly on the 3rd floor, secure in the privilege of their whiteness and the protection they believed it afforded. On May 9th, Samuel approached Ezra in the stable one last time. The old man looked at him and nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. That evening, Dinah pressed a small package into Samuel's hands, dried meat and bread that would last several days. Jacob gave him a woolen cap, dark and nondescript, that would hide his distinctive hair if he needed to travel by day. "You make sure you get far," Jacob whispered. "Make sure this means something." "It will," Samuel promised. "I'll make sure of it." That night, May 9th, 1847, Samuel lay awake until he heard the household settle into sleep. At midnight he rose and dressed in dark clothes he'd been gradually assembling. He took the knife from its hiding place along with the forged freedom papers, the stolen money, and one other item he'd carefully preserved, the page from the plantation ledger, showing his purchase price of $750. He folded this paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. It would be the first thing he'd burn on. See, he reached freedom, a symbolic gesture destroying the record of his having been bought and sold. But first, there was work to do. The house settled into the deep silence that comes after midnight. Samuel moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every creak and shadow. He climbed the servants' stair to the 3rd floor first, his soft leather shoes making no sound on the wooden steps. The children's rooms were arranged along the eastern hallway. Catherine's at the far end, Thomas's in the middle, Margaret's closest to the main staircase. Samuel stood outside Catherine's door for a long moment, the knife heavy in his hand. She was 8 years old, had shown him kindness, had brought him books, and treated him as human. For perhaps 30 seconds he wavered, caught between mercy and the cold logic that had brought him to this moment. Then he remembered Dinah's daughter, sold south at age 7. He remembered Jacob's sister, worked to death in the rice fields before she turned 10. He remembered his own sister, whose name he'd almost forgotten, dead, before she reached the age Catherine was now. The children of slave owners didn't get to be innocent. They were born into a system of brutality and would grow up to perpetuate it. Margaret had proven that in 10 years, little Catherine would be disgusting her own slaves with the same casual cruelty her mother exhibited. What happened in those rooms on the 3rd floor of Grantham Plantation happened quickly and quietly. Samuel moved with surgical precision, the knife doing its work before any of the children fully woke. He'd learned anatomy from helping Dr. Whitfield, during one of the physician's visits, had paid careful attention to where the blood vessels ran closest to the skin, had memorized the exact angle and depth needed to ensure death came quickly and silently. Catherine died, still half asleep, never understanding what was happening. Thomas woke just enough to see the pale face above him and tried to cry out, but the sound never formed. Margaret's eyes opened fully, and in them Samuel saw recognition, then disbelief, then terror, then nothing. 3 lives ended in less than 5 minutes. Samuel cleaned the knife carefully on Margaret's bedsheet, then moved to the 2nd floor, where the master bedroom stood at the front of the house. Thaddeus and Constance slept on opposite sides of a large 4-poster bed, an arrangement that spoke of intimacy long since cooled into habit. Constance lay on her right side, facing away from her husband, her breath deep and even from the laudanum. Thaddeus slept on his back, snoring softly, one hand thrown across his chest. Samuel stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, looking at the man who'd purchased him, measured him, displayed him, treated him as a curiosity rather than a human being. All the rage he'd suppressed for 3 years rose up like a tide, threatening to overwhelm the cold calculation that had brought him this far. He moved to Constance's side first. She died without waking, the laudanum ensuring she felt nothing. Thaddeus was different. Samuel needed him to know, needed him to understand in that final moment what his 3 years of scientific curiosity had produced. Samuel placed his pale hand over Thaddeus's mouth, pressing down hard. The planter's eyes snapped open, confusion transforming to terror as he saw the NK-eyed face above him. He tried to struggle, tried to reach for the pistol he kept in the bedside table, but Samuel had already removed it hours earlier during his preparations. "The specimen wants you to know something," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible over Thaddeus's muffled attempts to scream. "Every measurement you took, every test you ran, every time you displayed me to your friends, I was studying you too, learning your patterns, memorizing your weaknesses. You thought I was the subject, but you were wrong. You were the experiment, and this is the conclusion." The knife did its work a final time. Thaddeus Grantham died staring into those unsettling pink eyes, finally understanding too late that he'd brought his family's destruction into his own home, paid $750 for it, and treated it as a curiosity rather than a threat. But Samuel wasn't finished. He had one more death to ensure, one that was perhaps the most important of all. He found old Ruth in the kitchen quarters, the deaf cook who'd been kind to him in her way, who'd never participated in the cruelty, but had never challenged it either. She was 70 years old, too old to survive testimony at a trial, too old to run. Samuel stood over her bed for a long moment, the knife still in his hand, covered now in the blood of 5 people. Mercy stayed his hand this time, not because Ruth deserved it more than the others, but because he'd realized something. She would wake, find the bodies, sound the alarm, but by then he'd be gone, and her deafness would make her useless as a witness. She couldn't describe sounds, couldn't say she'd heard anything in the night, and her age would make her testimony suspect anywhere. Instead, Samuel did something more calculated. He left Ruth alive, but took with him something that would tell a story. Thaddeus's gold pocket watch, Constance's jewelry, silver candlesticks from the dining room, cash from the study desk. He made it look like robbery, like violence born of greed rather than rage. The authorities would chase a thief, not a ghost. He moved through the house one final time, gathering supplies he'd need for his journey. Then he did something that revealed the depth of his planning. He went to the library and left behind a single item. The page from the plantation ledger showing his purchase price, placed carefully on Thaddeus's desk, where it would be found immediately. Let them wonder, let them question, let them lie awake at night, knowing that the curiosity they displayed had been calculating vengeance while they measured his skull and tested his sensitivity to sunlight. Samuel left Grandantum Plantation at 3 in the morning. disappearing into the darkness that was his ally in ways the Grantham family had never considered. His pale skin, which they'd viewed as a curiosity, became perfect camouflage in the moonlight. His light-sensitive eyes, which they tested and documented, could see in darkness that left others blind. He moved through the swamp like a ghost, heading for the abandoned cabin Ezra had shown him. Behind him, the plantation house stood silent in the darkness, holding its terrible secret for a few more hours before dawn would bring discovery and horror. Ruth discovered the bodies at dawn when Catherine failed to appear for breakfast. The cook's screams, though silent to her own ears, brought the overseer Virgil Cates' run. Ning. What he found in that house would haunt Charleston society for years to come. 5 bodies, 7 if you counted the family dogs, who'd been quietly poisoned the night before to prevent their barking. The Charleston Courier's first edition that afternoon carried a front-page story describing the Grand Anthem massacre, detailing the brutal deaths and noting the disappearance of Samuel, an albino slave of unusual appearance, approximately 22 years of age. The article mentioned stolen valuables and suggested robbery as a motive, though it carefully avoided mentioning the page from the plantation ledger left on Thaddeus's desk, a detail the authorities quickly decided to suppress. Within hours, search parties assembled. Bloodhounds were brought from neighboring plantations, their handlers confident that Samuel's unusual scent would make him easy to track. But the dogs lost the trail at the Ashley River just as Samuel had planned. Denina and Jacob questioned separately. Both reported seeing Samuel flee toward the water around midnight, well before the murders took place. Their alibis were shaky, but held under initial questioning. The investigation, led by Charleston Sheriff Marcus Peton, quickly encountered problems that had nothing to do with finding Samuel and everything to do with what his capture might reveal. Dr. Whitfield, questioned about his interactions with the slave, reluctantly admitted that he'd engaged in lengthy conversations with Samuel and found him remarkably intelligent and articulate, perhaps dangerously so. This created an immediate problem for the planter class. If Samuel was intelligent enough to plan and execute such murders, it challenged something unexpected. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of hollow victory that tasted like ash. He'd achieved what he'd planned for 3 years, had taken revenge on the family that treated him as a curiosity rather than a human being. But the price of that revenge was that he could never be fully human again. He'd become the monster they'd always feared black people might be. Yet when he thought of Catherine's face, of Margaret's terror, of Thaddeus's final understanding, he found he couldn't regret it. They'd bought and sold human beings, broken families, destroyed lives with the casual indifference of people who'd never once questioned their right to own other people. His victims had been guilty by birth, by participation, by their willful blindness to the suffering their prosperity required. After a week, Samuel began moving only at night, heading slowly northeast. His plan was to reach Virginia, then Pennsylvania, then eventually Canada, where the Fugitive Slave Act couldn't touch him. But he needed money, supplies, and papers that would hold up under scrutiny. This was when the thefts began. The Rutland plantation, 20 miles north of Charleston, was hit first. On May 20th, the family woke to find their safe opened, $200 missing, along with food supplies and a traveling coat that belonged to Edmund Rutledge himself. The only clue was a single pale handprint on the windowsill, small enough to overlook, obvious enough to be intentional. 3 days later, the Garrison family in Orangeburg reported a similar theft. Money, papers, food, all taken while they slept. The house's lockbox had been opened with surgical precision, requiring either great skill or careful observation of where the key was hidden. A single white hair found on the study desk confirmed what everyone suspected, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Samuel was still operating in South Carolina, and he was moving with confidence that suggested extensive planning. The pattern continued through June. 6 more robberies, each executed with the same precision, each leaving just enough evidence to confirm Samuel's involvement without providing useful tracking information. The enslaved communities whispered about him with a mixture of fear and admiration. He'd become a ghost story, a phantom who moved through the night taking revenge on the planter class. But it was the note left at the Havsham plantation in Georgetown that transformed the investigation into something more urgent. On June 28th, the family woke to find their safe empty and a carefully written message on expensive paper that had been stolen from Mr. Havsham's own desk. "You collected me like a specimen. You displayed me like a trophy. You measured me like an animal. Did you think I wasn't measuring you in return? Did you think I wasn't learning your patterns, your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities? Every plantation house is the same, confident in its walls, secure in its power, blind to the threat you've created by treating human beings as property. Sleep well, gentlemen. Your curiosity has educated something you can't control." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched samples of Samuel's writing from Thaddeus Grantham's study. More importantly, it was written in perfect English, with sophisticated vocabulary and complex sentence structure, proof that undermined every argument about racial inferiority that justified the entire system of slavery. The Charleston Mercury ran a carefully edited version of the note, removing the more inflammatory passages, but the damage was done. Copists made duplicates and circulated them among the planter class. Abolitionist newspapers in the North somehow obtained the full text and published it alongside editorials condemning the institution of slavery. Samuel's revenge had expanded beyond the Grandanthem family to threaten the entire social order of the South. Sheriff Peaton doubled the reward to $5,000, an enormous sum that attracted bounty hunters from 3 states. Professional slave catchers, some of whom had reputations as brutal as their profession required, converged on South Carolina. But Samuel remained one step ahead, his unusual appearance somehow failing to mark him, despite dozens of searchers looking specifically for a pale-skinned black man with pink eyes. The secret to his continued evasion lay partly in the enslaved community's protection. Despite, or perhaps because of, his terrible actions, Samuel had become a symbol of resistance. Enslaved people who had information about his movements simply claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, known nothing. The same code of silence that protected runaway slaves now extended to protect their ghost. But Samuel had also planned more carefully than anyone realized. During his 3 years at Grandanthem Plantation, he had sewn ash into dark clothing that covered his pale skin, acquired tinted glasses that hid his pink eyes, and practiced moving with the stooped gait of an old man to disguise his height and grace. When necessary, he could pass as an elderly white man, his unusual coloring explained away as age and sun damage rather than albinism. In July, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A traveling photographer named Henry Dawes arrived in Charleston with news that he had encountered Samuel in Columbia, nearly 100 miles inland, and had actually spoken with him. Dawes had been setting up his daguerreotype equipment when a pale man with tinted spectacles approached, offering to pay $5 for a portrait, an unusual request from someone who should have been avoiding documentation. But Samuel knew exactly what he was doing. Dawes told Sheriff Peaton that he posed with perfect stillness, understood how long the exposure required, and even suggested angles that would capture his features most clearly. When Dawes asked why he wanted the portrait, Samuel reportedly said, "So there's a record of what I really looked like, not what they turned me into." Then he paid in cash and disappeared before Dawes could fully process what he meant. The resulting daguerreotype showed Samuel in profile, his pale face captured in perfect detail. His expression was neutral, but his pink eyes held something that looked almost like amusement. Copies were made and distributed to every sheriff's office and slave patrol across the South, but the gesture felt less like surrender and more like mockery. Samuel had voluntarily created the very documentation the authorities desperately wanted, and then vanished again. August brought an escalation that changed the nature of the pursuit. The Williams plantation in Colleton County was attacked on August 12th. If you enjoy dark and mysterious historical stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Black Rite Stories right now and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Don't forget to mention your country's name.